I personally think there shouldn't be patents on essential medicines. And as long as there is so much money to be made, we know money corrupts. It's even worse for an antibiotic because we don't want to create a new antibiotic that we're going to widely use. We want to keep it in reserve. What happened with COVID, and I think many scientists were challenged by how to deal with that. There was such a rush to bring new vaccines to the market, to the people. When there was results on clinical trials very early on, they did a press release for their investors before actually sharing the full data with the scientific community.
In this episode, we had Els Torreele on, who's worked over 2 decades in pharmaceutical research and development. She worked on neglected diseases and understanding why some people don't have access to medicines. Why has it become a luxury today? And we talked about many different problems we have with Big Pharma. She worked in organizations such as Médecins Sans Frontières. Through different organizations, she has talked to many different governments in developing countries, and we talked about a lot today.
We also talked about how patents impact the global south and just the big pharma industry itself. We discussed the problems and we also discussed the solutions. And there's aren't many I'd recommend more than Els to break down big pharma. So if you're interested in the topic, check out this video, like and subscribe, and
Yeah, we hope you enjoy.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Your presentation was great. I mean, it was around that medicines shouldn't be a luxury, because now it seems that they are. And one quote that really affected me or touched me, that marked me, was that Goldman Sachs report when they said, is finding a cure a good business model?
Mhm.
And do you think that highlights kind of the problems that we have today with, medicines and access to medicines?
Yeah, I think it's a great quote. It's of course a great quote to use and to illustrate how different the business thinking is as opposed to what we expect around health and pharmaceuticals. And I think for me this is one of the key issues, right? That we all think about pharmaceuticals, medicines, vaccines, diagnostics. Somehow they only exist because they serve a health purpose. That's kind of, I think, what everybody assumes. But when you start digging a little bit about how we as a society have organized the supply of medicines and vaccines, both the research and development, but the whole economic model, then you realize that actually for those that are in charge, so the companies and their shareholders, investors that actually direct that whole business, they don't care about health. And in a way, I mean, I think we should also not expect them to care about health, because they are private companies that are run for business and for profit. And especially since this financialization that has put even more pressure on, company directors to actually maximize financial return. So, in a way, the companies function as we would expect in a market economy. Where we have a problem is that we somehow expect that they will serve our health purpose. And for me, this is what I'm trying to make the case. It's like our policymakers also need to understand that this is not aligned, and that if we think that they need to serve our health purpose, we need to change the rules of the game. Or we need to create a different ecosystem where maybe it's not private companies, but not-for-profit organizations, or like some countries do, the public health system that creates and produces medicine. That's a different model, but we can't have both things. Well, that is what the reality shows us.
okay. Yeah, it's so interesting, the topic of big pharma. But when do you think this turning point was? I mean, big pharma didn't always have negative connotations surrounding it. So when do you think this turning point was in the big pharma industry? Could you walk
Well,
us through this?
I think if you call it big pharma, that's already, I think, after that change, in the sense that we have started to call, I mean, we have big pharma, we have big tobacco, we have big oil, we have big food, and we call them like that because they have become such a global monopolistic corporations that serve their own purpose, and in general are kind of almost, I mean, they're so powerful that it's very difficult for policymakers to affect them, also because they are global corporations, and policymakers often only have a national or regional or local mandates and electorate. So I think the word big before pharma is already kind of a relatively recent phenomenon, when more and more people in the health sector realize that what they do and how they behave is not conducive for public health. But I was actually, after the talk last week, talking a little bit more with Nick Darden, or Dearden, I'm totally sure how he pronounces his name. I haven't asked him. Because he, in his book that I've only now started to read, actually does a little bit of research on the earlier periods, and where he says, well, even in the 60s, 70s, the pharmaceutical companies were not really all that productive for public health. I mean, there have been, and this has been almost, I mean, it's not a battle, but between policymakers and the industry, is kind of trying to influence policy where to make it as conducive as possible for pharmaceutical companies to make money. And apparently that was already ongoing in the 70s and 80s as well. But what I think is very clear, if you see the switch from the concept of blockbuster drugs, for instance, is really something that was coined, I think, only in the 1990s. And blockbuster drugs were initially coined for drugs that reached $1 billion sales.
Wow.
That, back in the 90s was huge, and there were very few of those blockbusters. And you saw that the industry, once they realized that this was possible, and this reflects back to the much later comment of Goldman Sachs. How did you get a blockbuster drug? That was for chronic diseases. Chronic diseases where people needed to take medicine every day for the rest of their life. That is as opposed to infectious diseases where usually you have a cure. Antibiotics, and this is where the business model doesn't work for antibiotics. Ideally, you take antibiotics, 3 days, a week, and then you stop and you're cured. Of course, that is much less interesting from a business perspective than if you have, cholesterol-lowering drugs or for your blood tension or other things where people are supposed to take it every day for the rest of their life. And that has created that blockbuster model, and where you can see that the priorities of the companies have moved away from infectious diseases to chronic diseases, because that's much more profitable as a business model. And then you had this blockbusters, and then what that meant is that, again, research priorities focused there, and there were gaps. And for instance, everything that was a more rare disease, etc., was not being addressed. And then policymakers tried to, make some more incentives for the companies such that they would also look at rare diseases. And then we have the shift of what we have then started to call niche busters. So from blockbusters, which were products that were, the individual price was not very high, but because people take them for the whole life, and so the sales in terms of the volumes were huge, they created a lot of profit. And then we went to the niche busters, where it's actually usually rare diseases, where then the policy incentive was a high tolerance for high prices. And so then you had diseases where there were little patients but where they were able to charge high prices and the health insurance systems accepted to pay for that. And they suddenly also made $1 billion profit or revenue, but not by big volumes, but by high prices. And then we have had the mix, and I think that's Gilead with their hepatitis C drug in 2014. I think the first one was called Sovaldi, which was a cure, so an infectious disease, hepatitis C, for which we didn't have any good medicine actually before. They came with what was a breakthrough medicine, but they said, well, we're going to charge high prices anyways. And so that was the $84,000 per treatment launching price in the US. So more than $1,000 per day per pill, which kind of blew everybody's minds. And we were like, wow, I mean, how dare they ask prices that were kind of at the order of magnitude that was previously more associated with these niche busters for a disease that many patients that would have many patients, and they got slammed for it. But in a way, they got away with it because they then gave some rebates and there were some negotiations. But I think many countries ended up paying in the range of 30, 40, 50,000. We didn't really know because one of the big challenges is also that prices are often secret. But we kind of learned more or less that this was the range, which was still enormous for an infectious disease drug, right? Where we were used to much, much lower prices.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we talk about this term, big pharma, that wasn't always here. And I think now, even especially after COVID, this term big pharma is also associated with a lot of conspiracy theories. So it's harder maybe to talk about it, but it doesn't mean that it is something that's real. Understanding that big pharma is a business, medicine is a business, we can look at, what are incentives to those people when we can, make connections from A to B and think this is not crazy. And talking about, recurring customers, for example, you mentioned it's a profitable business model. I heard about this thing where, so for example, diabetes is very profitable because people need to take insulin all the time. And I heard this story back, I don't know, this year, a couple months ago, that in China, some doctors found a cure to, they took a guy with type 2 diabetes and they transplanted a cell that that produces insulin. And since then, he hasn't needed an insulin shot. And then I saw, look, I don't know the details of the story, but then I saw Big Pharma was lobbying against this in the US to make this illegal. So,
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it just
Of
shows
course,
that,
yeah.
it, yeah, just understanding the business and knowing that maybe they don't have our health benefits at their heart of their mission.
No, that's a very interesting example. I hadn't heard about that, but I would imagine, well, it would be interesting to know that if it were an American or a European company that came up with that, basically cell therapy, because that is today part of the niche buster things. For the time being, these cell therapies are all, cell and gene therapies are all very much for rare diseases. I'm not sure to which extent there is a research, research going on to look for those type of things. But in a way, bringing it back to the Goldman Sachs remark, yeah, if you could have a cure for diabetes, where then there is no more need for giving giving insulin, I mean, it would be a major breakthrough. But would it ever get to the market? It's a very good question. People have questions, and I am not so much into these conspiracy theories, but HIV/AIDS, which is an infectious disease, but where people are taking drugs for life because we have not found a cure. some people say, well, maybe there is also, I mean, there is research and development for new medicines going on, but are they actually doing every effort possible to further potentially medicines that would actually cure it? And again, it's a difficult, we can't answer that question, whether there have been opportunities where certain lines of research would go in that direction. They don't get as much money necessarily than, for instance, what I was mentioning, the research towards living forever gets lots of money, while certain other things, maybe if we would put more money, we would get there, but that is much less attractive. And it's difficult to analyze as well. We can only see that we don't have the cure for AIDS. We do have continuously lifelong treatments. So yeah.
Yeah. I think everyone talks about the nefarious nature of Big Pharma. But I wanted to ask you, what are the rules Big Pharma goes by? Or do you think, I mean, if the regulating mechanism is just to impose fines, surely we need to revise how we perhaps manage Big Pharma. And what are the rules which keeps them constrained? Are there really any rules, or do you think they have the ability to do whatever they want?
No, actually, they are very strictly regulated in terms of they cannot bring anything to the market, and that has a history, especially in terms of protecting public health. So they need to demonstrate that any product has an acceptable safety profile or toxicity profile, if you put it differently. And that, I think, has also, I mean, you may have read about this, I don't remember the name of a medicine in the 1960s that was given to pregnant women, and then there were many birth defects that were kids that were born with terrible birth defects. And that has then created a much stronger regulation that a company or anyone that wants to put a new medicine on the market needs to do special studies to see whether there might be any impacts before it can be prescribed to pregnant women, for example. And so I think that there is a very strong regulation around safety. What is less, let's say, strong is around showing medical benefits. I think what regulators, and again, this is how it has changed over the years, regulators, whether it's the European Medicines Agency, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, the UK is now, what is it called? MHRA,
NHS?
I think. No, the regulatory authority. It's
okay.
MHRA. Can't remember what it stands for. It's actually an independent body that every country has, where if you want to put a medicine on the market, they need to approve that. And what they do that based on very extensive documentation of the quality of your product, the safety or potential toxicity of your product, and the efficacy. That those are the three main things. And so that's where you do clinical studies and preclinical studies, etc. And so it's a big body of evidence. But what has the current doctrine is, okay, you need to establish that it's good quality, that there are no impurities that could create toxicities, etc., that you can reproducibly have every time you produce a tablet, it's the same tablet and the same milligrams of ingredients, etc. And then there is what we call the benefit-harm ratio, where you need to provide evidence that the potential positive effects outweigh the potential negative effects, and that is based on clinical and preclinical research. But what has happened over the years is that the regulator looks at this one investigational drug in and of itself and looks whether the data indeed show that this ratio between the potential benefits and the harm is acceptable. But it doesn't look whether it's actually giving any benefits compared to what we already have. So they do not impose a company to do a comparative trial comparing their new treatment with the best available treatment that is already used to show that it's better. That is not needed. And to me, this is a major problem. And I was told that previously in a number of countries, for instance, in Norway, this was there was a precondition to be able to bring this new drug to the market, that you had to show the added benefit for patients. But that has been lobbied away because for companies, and their argument is, well, it's okay that we have multiple options because some patients will prefer this or it will work better. But if there is no evidence that anything works better than what you have, I don't see the point of having more of the same. It's actually a big waste. And we also know that with a lot of marketing, the ideas being created that new is better, even though new might not be better. But, you know, I mean, people think that because it's new, it will be better because we always like the latest, right?
Or that example where they have the same drug, but they brand it differently. They say, oh, it's a pill for this, it's a pill for that, it's a pill for this, but it's actually all the same pill.
Well, they're not exactly the same, but they have the same impact. Like, for instance, now, since we have these actually diabetes drugs that turn out to also have this weight loss effect that have become so popular, every company is now trying to get a drug on the market to have part of that market with something that will be more of the same. Maybe some will come with something that is better, but for the time being, it's kind of all trying to grab a part of that market. But what is the patient benefit of having 5 drugs that actually do the same with just different brands, or even slightly different actual chemical compounds? But if they do the same, if they have the same mechanism of action, like, what's the point, right? And this is why I think that we should ask our regulators, to come back to your question, what can we do? Is actually ask our regulators to demand evidence for therapeutic benefit, for patient benefits. But of course, companies prefer to have a lower evidence standard, of course.
Do you think it would be beneficial to also ask them how many patients this would help? Going back to your point that, you know, now they're making a lot of very niche medicines, you know, that would maybe help a low amount of people, but they sell it for expensive amounts. Do you think it would be beneficial to push them to make medicine that would affect a large number of people?
Well, that's a difficult one because, I mean, everybody deserves to have treatments for whichever disease they have. And I don't think you want to, I mean, people who have a rare disease, they should have medicines for their disease as well. So I don't think that we want to, to say only for the diseases that affect the most people. I think you need all of that. But you need to find a way to indeed be able to address both diseases that affect poor people and rich people, and rare diseases and frequent diseases. It needs to be based on health needs, not on where the possibility to make money is highest, because that is what we have today. And sometimes these are rare diseases and sometimes these are frequent diseases. But as long as they can make a lot of money, they're happy.
And I want to ask you, how do you think big pharma affects developing countries? And I believe you worked in South Africa, right, at some point?
Not in South Africa itself, but I've been working with a number of partners in many countries: South Africa, Brazil, Congo, and others. Yes.
So how do you think? So we talked about how, you know, big pharma really isn't addressing maybe all these issues. Even, you know, you mentioned HIV. Then there's also things like malaria. We're seeing it's been ages since we haven't found a solution. What do you think Big Pharma's role is in all this? And
Well, again, I mean, Big Pharma, the companies that are pursuing profit over public health, I mean, the only thing what they want to do is sell the product that they have to the wealthy elites everywhere, right? Because I mean, if you think about the market's size in terms of revenues, the United States by itself is more than 50% of the global market by value. Then you have, Europe, Japan, I mean, like all of that together, like the wealthy countries together represent probably, I would say, 90% of the market by value. And so the other 10% is where the pharmaceutical companies manage to sell to the wealthy people that exists in every country, but where often they have to pay out of their pocket. But if you're wealthy enough, that kind of works, because in certainly in Europe, only to some extent in the US, you have a healthcare system that has health insurance, either public or private, but where none of us pay for our medicines out of our pocket. We pay maybe a little contribution, and that's depending from country to country, but none of us pay these very high prices. But in many countries in the global south, there are no such health insurance systems that cover the majority of those costs. And there, the impact of high prices, and even high prices, it's all very relative. If we talk about HIV/AIDS, the current treatments are less than $100 per person per year. So they're very, very cheap. Any new medicine that comes to the market, even if it's a few thousands, becomes unaffordable, because the difference between the availability of money to buy medicines is so much different. And so to come back to your question, I don't think that pharmaceutical companies and the big pharma has a big role to play, because according to their business model, why would they care about all these people that don't have purchasing power? But this is why we need to find other ways of developing and supplying medicines that actually address the needs, as you say. I mean, malaria, African sleeping sickness, dengue. And there are solutions that have been tried over the past 20 plus years, which are often either they're not-for-profit organizations, such as the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, one of the organizations that I was with before. There are also what they call public-private partnerships, where there is collaboration with pharmaceutical companies, often either the big ones, and then it's their corporate social responsibility departments, but that's very marginal, or sometimes, small companies and medium-sized companies that have a different financial pressure and can do certain things if there is public money available to actually for that. There are a number of ways in which we can do that, but so far, this all remains like exceptions within the bigger system. And I don't think that, I mean, for me, medicines are part of the right to health. You cannot achieve that by having an exception for this and an exception for that. You need to have a structural solution such that we don't have to kind of one by one find solutions, exceptions within the bigger system.
It seems that you paint this picture that under this current system, it's normal that, these pharmaceutical companies are acting the way they are. And you mentioned that you worked in a nonprofit that was developing medicines. Can you talk a bit about that? Did it find success? What troubles did you have achieving your goals? And do you think that is the answer, that we should switch to nonprofits? Or do you think it's more complicated than that? It's not just nonprofits.
It's more complicated than that, obviously. But and indeed, I was part of the founding partners of this organization called Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative that we created actually in 2003, so 20 plus years ago. And this was created by Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, together with a number of actually public research institutes in a number of developing countries, for instance, Brazil, Kenya, India, Malaysia. I think the network of the Pasteur Institutes that is in different countries was also part of it. And that idea came, first of all, from the observation that pharmaceutical companies were neglecting the health needs of a large proportion of the world population, in particular those living in the global south. We call that then neglected diseases. This is not a characteristic of the disease, but more the fact that they were neglected by those that chose which drugs to develop and not. And what we did by doing that is basically saying, well, we want to show that it is possible to develop new treatments for some of those most neglected diseases outside the context of the commercial pharma sector. Because, and then you have to go back 20, 25 years in time. At that time, the discourse was, there is no, only the pharmaceutical companies can do it. It's so complicated. It requires a lot of money. We can only do it and nobody else can do it. And so we were with a number of public health people and researchers saying, well, we don't think that's true. And let's try it out. Let's show that it can be done. And it was a success. The organization has meanwhile developed multiple treatments for some of the most neglected diseases, shown that it doesn't have to cost multiple billions of dollars as the pharmaceutical industry claims. But of course, also noticed, experienced that it is not that easy. And one of the big problems with that model is, how do you make it financially sustainable? Because that model, it's a not-for-profit, could count on donations, funding from the development corporations of, the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, France, Spain. So, and a number of charitable foundations, Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But it doesn't create income, right? And so at the dependency of public and foundation funding is a major challenge. Now, I think it does show that it doesn't cost all that much money and that it may be a very good investment of public money, but then you need to convince policymakers on the longer term that they want to continue supporting that. And that's where I think that we really, and the NDI was not the only one, but there are a few of those not-for-profit organizations that have shown that it is possible to do that on malaria, tuberculosis, etc. But we need a sustainable model. You can't have those organizations having to beg every year with the donors, like, please give us some more money. It needs to be part of a structural solution that can be either not-for-profit organizations that are independent, or because we also, as the NDI, worked often together with public research institutes. In Brazil, for instance, you also have public manufacturing of medicines and of vaccines. And so there are a number of ways in which you can, not with the intention of making profits, but just to deliver tools for public health, do that. But it requires public responsibility, including the financing. And it should be structural. And this is where, I've been working quite a bit with Brazil, which is a very interesting example there, where they have decided that they want to use their public research capabilities and manufacturing of both vaccines and drugs to create essential drugs and vaccines that they supply to their health sector, to their NHS, the Brazilian variant of it, that supplies the medicines and vaccines to the population. And of course, it is financed by the Ministry of Health, and it costs money, but it costs much less money to do it like that than to buy it in the international market from these big companies. Now, what that requires, of course, is that they need to be able to have access to the technology. There needs to be technology transfer, technology sharing, especially every time there are new tools like mRNA vaccines. They are now creating their own capacity to produce mRNA vaccines. It would be easier if those that already know how to do that would be willing to share their technology with the Brazilians. For now, that hasn't happened, so they are trying to reinvent it themselves. In South Africa, there is a company trying, with the help of the World Health Organization, to develop mRNA vaccines there, also to share the technology with other global South companies. So there are things happening, but they need to have structural support, and including financing, strategic financing, such that they can develop that capacity. And that requires a political change to believe in the role of public and not-for-profit activities for health. And that means prioritizing health and not making money. And that's where the policymakers remain too confused with the idea, as I showed in my presentation, that you can do it all. You can have both addressing health needs and have a very profitable pharmaceutical sector. And that is not possible.
Okay, on that note, do you think the relationship between Big Pharma, not the relationship, but just how Big Pharma, they sort of rig the patent system, or they use it to their advantage, and then we have these, the US Patent and Trademark Office, they kind of facilitate the extraction of these supernormal profits from Big Pharma. And I think in the US, the top 10 best-selling drugs, Big Pharma essentially just uses a plethora of patents, and they all have just been like copyrighted and patented, so no one can access this, can access the information or the actual process. So what role do you think Big Pharma has in, or patents have in, preventing, perhaps, let's say, the sharing of the intellectual property rights, which are so essential?
Absolutely a critical role in the sense that they are currently a critical blocking role. So what has happened is that while initially a patent was meant as a policy tool where you say, well, you give a temporary monopoly, but the objective is actually dissemination of technology and follow-on innovation. What has happened in the practical implementation of the patent laws in many countries, including in the US, is that patents have become this kind of almost a natural right, and there are more and more patents being taken that is called a patent ticket. So there are medicines that have tens to hundreds of patents on just one single medicine, and they are staggered in time because a patent normally is for 20 years, but then they organize it to stagger it such that the effective patent life becomes 30 years, 40 years. And during all that time, because that is the point of having a patent, the patent owner can prohibit anyone else to produce, to research, to sell, to use the subject of that invention. And so the whole idea of this trade-off between promoting innovation and promoting the dissemination of the technology has totally gotten out of balance, where it's only the promotion of the monopoly that is there, and the dissemination doesn't happen, the technology sharing. And even normally a patent, if you read the patent, the idea is that in the patent document, all the information, the technical information about how to produce this invention should be in there. But in reality, it's not the case. If you try to do the same based on the patent information, you will never succeed, because it's not a peer-reviewed article. It's just a document, a technical document that is made by lawyers and scientists to protect the invention, and it's not meant to actually reproduce it and then work with it. And so we have a total misalignment there, and the trade-off is absolutely out of space. Yeah.
It's very interesting as well, because I think the patent system also has an impact on global South countries. I mean, first, in our previous discussion with Hadron Chang, he was mentioning big pharma companies, they send people out to the global South, and these people go and speak to the witch doctors and learn indigenous techniques and knowledge, and they go and try and copy or emulate some of the practices of the indigenous people, and they'll take that back to the US, and then they'll try and copyright some of this knowledge or techniques or whatever it is. And then also I was reading about, I think, was it last year, that there was this subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, and they wanted to extend their patent on bedaquiline. And this is like a tuberculosis drug. And now in India, I think 40% of the population suffer with tuberculosis. And so the price of this drug was extremely high. And I think the Indian authority, I'm not sure which one it was, refused his patent. But this just had such a great impact, or it was estimated to have such a significant impact, because the price of this drug was extraordinarily high. But refusing this patent apparently was estimated to cut the price from $46 to $8. So clearly patents have some negative impacts on. So it kind of seems like the purpose of patents, it seems as if it prevents accessibility to the most important drugs. And it's kind of, this is the opposite of what big pharma should be about. So from your knowledge and your work, what impacts have you seen from patents on the global South? Do you think they've really suffered from?
No, absolutely. I mean, the example you give is a typical one. The first is already like, I personally think there shouldn't be patents on essential medicines and other health technologies. Certainly, if the patents are used to prohibit others to use it, and that's where I come back to my like, medicines and vaccines are not ordinary commodities. I mean, if a new television comes out and you can't afford it and it's a bit more expensive, okay, well, maybe you will continue to look at your old one, or you don't watch television, whatever. But for a critical medicine or vaccine, and often that is life-saving, we shouldn't apply this type of ideas. And so for me, the fact that you have patents that in the end result in prohibiting people to access that health technology is problematic. And moreover, as you were saying, for the tuberculosis vaccine and for many other things, what companies do is to make that patent or that monopoly as long as possible by having additional patents on small tweaks, etc. And there it's very interesting that the Indian patent authorities, in their patent law, while they had to abide with this famous TRIPS agreement that globalized patents for 20 years, including on pharmaceuticals in 1995, the Indians always had a little bit of flexibilities to say, well, we only will give patents if we think there is real innovation in there, that it's really inventive, that it's not just an ordinary little tweak that has no impact. And so civil society groups have been challenging some of those what we call frivolous patents that we think are not deserved because they are not actually based on something inventive or doesn't bring medical benefit. And so in the Indian law, there is this flexibility. And sometimes it has worked to go to court and say that patent should be banned. And that means that you then have less long monopolies than happening in other countries. And just to give another example, a counter example, in South Africa, unfortunately, they have a patent law that is extremely permissive in the sense that they do not examine patent applications, whether they are actually worthy of a patent. They just, you apply and you get it. And so in South Africa, there are many of those patents that should never have been granted, but you get them. And that means that in South Africa, often those monopolies, and I think the question of the bedaquiline drug, I think in South Africa, the monopoly was extended, while in India, they could fight it. And so all that to say that the impacts are really, really important, because South Africa is another of those countries where there is a very high burden of tuberculosis, and where it shouldn't be in the prerogative of companies to become a blockage for people to access them.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. It's a shame that we have patents blocking the global south reaping the benefits. Do you think there's scope for any change or any revision of the patent system? Or
And also, you mentioned the TRIPS agreement. Could you also explain that?
Yeah, so patents have been a policy tool that have been around for many years, but and especially in what we call industrialized countries, they have been used in a way to actually, depending on the level of technological capability that a country has, initially you develop that by copying your neighbor, etc. And once you have established a certain capability technologically to innovate yourself, you usually want to protect yourself that others can't copy. That is, and if you see the history of almost any industrial countries, that is how patents have evolved. And the example of Switzerland is a very flagrant one. Up to the 1970s, Switzerland did not accept patents on pharmaceuticals. They may have had patents on the the process, the chemical process, etc., but allowing the Swiss scientists to copy and try to find ways to produce medicines that were, for instance, invented in Germany. But then once that capability was well established, Switzerland also wanted to have patents on their innovation and installed the patent law. But so all of that to say, that was in the 1970s, and as we know, Switzerland today is a very strong pharma country. But until the 1990s, many countries, certainly in the global south, they didn't even have a patent law, or they had patents on certain technologies, but not others. Some countries specifically excluded pharmaceutical and health products from patenting, etc. But then, and this has been a long lobby activity of a number of big companies, including Pfizer, that has been well documented. They have convinced the World Trade Organization, which is an organization where most countries are a member of, and it's supposedly to facilitate trade, etc., to have this one agreement, which is called TRIPS agreement, which stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, that actually obliged all the countries to accept a minimum of 20 years of patents on any technology.
Worldwide.
Worldwide. And patents, every country needs to organize their own patent law. And so that agreement in one signature, countries signed that they would all organize a patent system and protect and enforce patents in every domain of technology for 20 years. And I think at that moment, because most developing countries, they were not having a lot of technological capacity, and they probably may not have fully realized what they were signing away. And I'm sure that, I mean, in a trade negotiation, they got, for instance, access for their textile export to the European or American market, or I don't know. I mean, it was a trade-off in which they kind of did not probably realize as much as they should, how much they were signing away for health. Also, you have to remember, these agreements are signed by trade ministers. The health ministers are not at the table, and nobody kind of was really watching what the health implications were But that became very clear very, very soon after. And Hoon also has written his book, Kicking Away the Ladder. For me, that TRIPS agreement really was a moment of kicking away the ladder for technological development of the global south by not allowing them to develop their technological capabilities like the industrial countries have done by first copying and learning how to do it before they accepted patents to protect their innovation. And so the global south countries have immediately been confronted with that all technological innovation happens in industrialized countries, and they can only be recipients and can't or have really difficulties to access those technology to even learn and improve their technological capabilities. There are some exceptions. I think India, had quite a strong pharmaceutical industry, but only generics. They didn't have yet the capacity to really bring that innovation, and they're still struggling because of that gap in most sophisticated technological capacity.
Countries like India have a long history of natural medicines. Even Hajun was mentioning an example where some American company tried to patent the use of turmeric in medicines, and then the Indian government had to step in and say, "Hey, no, we've been doing this for 4,000 years." Something you said shocked me. It was Pfizer that was at the origin of this TRIPS agreement.
Pfizer was one of the companies that were there were different sectors that were visionary enough to see how intellectual property rights would become important for them. The other is Hollywood, the whole entertainment industry, because you have patents and then copyright, which is the kind of variant that is much more used in the whole entertainment sector. So Hollywood, pharma were two of the, and I think IT as well were the kind of, because IT was back then much less big than it is today. Today you have big tech, but then it was a bit less. They saw how much they could then impose actually their hegemony, their technological hegemony on the rest of the world. And and Pfizer, that has been really well documented, was very key in that.
Yeah, Els, I wanted to tell you, naturally I have been quite skeptical about big pharma. And I think cases like Merck and Vioxx sort of justify that. I mean, I'm not trying to deny or dismiss the overall impact of big pharma. I'm sure it's extended lots of people's lives, but how was Vioxx allowed to happen? And there weren't really any consequences from that mishap. I mean, I think Merck, the company, they're still around today, and their market caps increased about 3 times. So I don't know if you were working on big pharma at the time, but what was the impact? And could you talk us through the Vioxx situation?
Yeah, I haven't followed it in very much detail, but in essence, what happened was that they brought this drug onto the market. I'm now don't remember. I think it was an anti-inflammatory drug that I don't remember exactly. Anyway, and it was widely used before it started to become clear that there are major cardiological side effects. And it turned out that actually Merck knew that all along, but has been hiding in their clinical development the data that actually showed that, and in the data that they submitted to the regulatory authorities, the evidence for the toxicity was not there. And so not only did they hide evidence of toxicity that they knew, but then also, of course, they were promoting that medicine, as they all do for blockbuster drugs, widely. And so the drug has been on the market for multiple years, and there has been estimates of the number of people that have been harmed, including deaths. I mean, and like not a few, but thousands of people that died as a consequence of the cardiological side effect of that drug. And they were, they had in the end to withdraw the medicine, but not after having made a lot of money, because it was a real blockbuster drug. And they got fines, but the fines that they get, and I don't remember the exact number, but this is for those companies the cost of doing business. It doesn't really, and nobody is, nobody is personally responsible also, or held responsible. That this is one of the difficulties of the accountability. These big companies, Johnson & Johnson has been fined many millions for their role in promoting these opioids that we know have led to many overdose deaths in the United States. They've been fined, but they just pay the fine, and it can be 500 million if they have made multiple billions. And as you say, their market cap is hardly influenced, because that has become part of the cost of doing business. And again, this is when, if there is so much money involved, it's very difficult to protect the population against these misbehaviors, whether it's over marketing of harmful drugs, hiding, because this is a known case, but there are many other cases where we know that the evidence was not fully transparent. And think about this. Today, pharmaceutical companies wanting to put a new medicine or vaccine onto the market, they do the clinical trials, they design the trials, they finance them, they analyze the data, they have the data, they decide what to publish and what not, of the evidence that should show the harm and the benefit of that drug or vaccine. For me, this is a complete conflict of interest. It's unthinkable that the one company who has a vested interest in the outcome of a trial does the trial, designs it, holds it, everything. In my view, we should go to a system where a company can develop a drug up to early phase 1, 2, and then the big clinical trials should be done by independent researchers paid by the public, or even paid by the company. It doesn't matter, but they should be completely independent of the financial interests. But that is not how it works today.
But doesn't this just seem like the rational and logical step to take, is outsourcing the clinical trials to maybe a third party, or maybe something controlled by the government? Because I think even with Vioxx, the clinical trials, it was all successful. And I think during the investigation, there was instances where rats had died when they had taken the drug. So how have we not learned our lessons from Vioxx? So many innocent people died. Why is there still a resistance or a reluctance to change how we do our clinical trials?
Money. I think the
our
answer,
money, you know how it is.
It's a shame.
But because, and this is again why, if you confuse financial interests with health interests, it's not going to work. And I think the fact that today, indeed, the clinical trial data, and not only the clinical trial, all the data, because it's also the preclinical, the rats and all of that, is not publicly available. So the company has all the data, they know everything. In principle, they are obliged to submit all those data to the regulatory authority. But how do you know whether they do that or they don't? There is no way to check that, right? You don't know what you don't know. So the regulator can accept all the data. They don't know whether there are more or not. And that is considered commercially sensitive information. And pharmaceutical companies have been claiming, and successfully, that that data cannot be shared publicly. Part of it they will then publish in publications, but again, we know in publications these are often ghost-written, and they only selectively publish the data that fits into their commercial strategy, right? And so But again, I mean, people have gone to court on that, but the commercial imperatives and our judicial system keeps on confirming that companies have the right to that commercial secrecy because it's in their commercial interests, and then we're done, right? I totally disagree. I think it's incredibly, I mean, how can we accept that the data that show the harm and benefits of the medicines that we are taking, and even doctors, they do not have full access? I think it's incredible.
Yeah, and I even read about the revolving door between like the FDA and big pharma companies. I think there was this bloke called Jeffrey Siegel, who was, I think he was a manager at FDA, or he was in some sort of position of authority. And he was actually overseeing this, the approval of this drug for Gene Tech, which I think is the name of the pharmaceutical company. So he, in a position where he's meant to, you know, he takes a minute to assess whether this drug is viable or not, and then he all of a sudden he left that company after reviewing that drug, and then he actually went to join Gene Tech. So I just think, how do instances like this happen, and like when are we going to get this change? I mean, does this happen a lot? Are there many instances of this?
It's difficult to know. I think there are instances of conflicts of interest, revolving doors. It's well known between companies, the regulators, and intermediary companies. It's a very complex, dynamic ecosystem. But as long as there is so much money to be made, we know money corrupts explicitly or implicitly, and this is where, I mean, we also need to understand that, for instance, in Europe, the European Medicines Agency, it's not part of the health mandate of Europe. It's part of the industrial kind of, I mean, they're there to oversee companies, but their mandate is also, and the same for the FDA, is to facilitate the business of the companies. They need to protect public health, but they are also accountable to the business community. If you read the annual report of the FDA in US, their annual report is one big kind of bloating, like, we have approved so many drugs and so many drugs have gotten accelerated approval. I mean, how is that a measure of public health? How much drugs that you approve? I mean, if they're all bad, you shouldn't approve any. So I mean, so I think we've gotten the priorities wrong, because we don't put public health as the first and foremost purpose, and eliminate the rest, because we all think that it's about our economy. In fact, we all think this is what the policymakers, that's how they regulate the pharmaceutical industry, and the regulatory agencies are part of that.
I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a great case study for almost every single point we talked about. There's so much to cover, but here we're talking about, you know, historically, all these things that happen with the pharmaceutical companies, and it seems that there's so many reasons for us to distrust. But then when COVID-19 came, like, this pharmaceutical and this topic became so politicized and so difficult to talk about. And on one side, it seemed like all of a sudden, so here you talked about, like, you know, distrust, you know, we talk about this Vioxx thing, we talk about problems with clinical trials. How do you kind of see all these people that brought criticisms to the vaccine? Obviously a complicated subject, because then we're talking, you know, oh, we have to save people's lives. But then on the other side, there was a lot of skepticism behind these historically, you know, bad companies like Pfizer and things like that, and Johnson & Johnson, that had, you know, problems with clinical trials, providing this vaccine What's your kind of view on that and that whole situation with vaccines?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I remember during COVID, I mean, being an active observer and criticist advocate for public health it was really difficult because, of course, I do believe in, I believe it's not a question of a believer. Like, I think medicines and vaccine can be really important public health tools. And
Right.
amongst
Science
that,
is not something you should believe in. It's right.
yeah,
Something
exactly.
that
That's
is,
why
right?
well, it's not about believing or is. The thing is, like, I believe in the scientific methods as a rational way of trying to do evidence-based medicine. Let's put it that. I think evidence-based medicine has its merits and but it's always a matter of, like, you accumulate evidence. I mean, and that was very clear during COVID. In the beginning, we had no idea what this thing was, and then we learn, and it makes and this is the scientific method, right? Every time there is different new pieces of evidence that change your overall understanding of what it means, but there are always many questions that remain, and so it's that navigating that uncertainty by adding evidence, by doing specific research questions, and that's part of the scientific method. But what happened with COVID, and I think many scientists were kind of challenged by how to deal with that. There was such a rush to bring new vaccines to the market, to the people. And where, for instance, companies were taking the leads, although, as we all know, that many of this research was actually based on a lot of academic research from many people for many years. Moderna, this was the NIH that actually was the biggest partner, but in the way that the US functions, public research is then kind of done in collaboration with the company, and then the company becomes the leader. In the UK, we had Oxford that was put into a forced marriage with AstraZeneca, etc., etc. And then you had these companies that were, driving the work. And what we saw, and that was a sign of this difficulty, is that they, when there was results on clinical trials very early on, they did a press release for their investors before actually sharing the full data with the scientific community. And it has been, that has been challenged because all the scientists say, but wait a minute, because they do a press release and you have some top level data, but you can't really, as a scientist, understand, like, wait a minute, what are they comparing with what? What does this really mean? And they said, well, we're going to publish the data, the full data as soon as possible. And that may have happened 1 week, 2 weeks, 5 weeks later. But at the moment when there is such a stress, etc., about we need new vaccines, what happened is that decisions were being taken based on the press release of companies. I'm sure that governments have made advanced procurement, etc., based on the early evidence without actually, or that the scientific community had access to the full data. And this is where there was a real tension between the commercial interests, because the press release is for the shareholders, and you saw immediately the shares going up like crazy, right? And we, as a scientific community, were wait, where is the data? What are you really saying? And remember, there was this whole confusion that I think is partially based on that, about whether the vaccines were protecting us against being infected. We now know that they were very bad at that the main thing about the vaccines is that they protected us to become severely ill or die. That was and that was very important, given in the beginning how many people that were dying. But they were never really good at protecting us from being infected. But that became all a blur
Yeah.
because the information was not available. The question, and actually the clinical trials were not designed to give an answer to that question. While this, I mean, from an epidemic point of view, this is a critical question. But the companies designed the clinical trials, right? I mean, the public health community was not involved. The companies, it's their prerogative, and they designed the clinical trial in a way that gave the most rapid readout of the thing that could be most rapidly measured. And yeah, that was important, but I think if the public health community would have designed the trials, we would have done it differently. And it has consequences because the way the vaccines have been rolled out were kind of also done as if they protected against transmission.
Yeah.
Because
Like that was
remember,
a lot of messaging behind it, was that?
yeah. And again, I think that there was a lot of confusion, and I don't have, like, I don't think we know exactly, but to me, I'm convinced that part of that confusion was also nurtured by the ability of companies to selectively share certain data to design the trials in the way that worked best for them, which might not have been what worked best for for stopping the pandemic, for instance. And again, in the same way that I said earlier, it's crazy that we allow the party that has a vested interest to do the clinical trial and to design the research questions that will be addressed. Because that is really important, certainly in a pandemic situation where, I mean, speed is everything. And then, and you need to do a trade-off because you can't address all the research questions at the same time, but it's not up to the company to decide which trade-off. But that
Especially
is how
when
it happens.
in this case with the COVID vaccines, how much government spending was used to fund it.
Totally.
You would think they would be involved in the testing of these things, and especially when it was the governments themselves that were doing all the buying of these vaccines.
Exactly. But this is where the current model to kind of leave the initiative and the responsibility with the private sector, it's so deeply ingrained in people's mind that they don't seem to be able to think differently. And yeah, it's something that we need to keep on repeating, that there is this fundamental conflict of interest that we need to somehow step in as the public health community and create mechanisms to do that, because we don't have them now, because we believe that it's normal that I'll give you another example. A company that has a drug on the market for a certain disease, let's say cancer, a certain type of cancer, and there may be evidence that it could work for something else, either another cancer or Alzheimer. I'm just making this up. Today, the company who has that drug, and I'm using that word, who has that drug, we kind of accept that this is the ownership through both intellectual property rights and also the marketing authorization that they hold for that drug. Now, if we want to use it for another indication and do clinical trials to show that it would work, we call that repurposing. If the company is not interested, they can just refuse. And it's like, wait a minute, like, how is that they have such an ownership that they can refuse to do studies with that drug unless you buy it in the market, but sometimes it's unaffordable. Or even if you do the studies, if you show that it actually works, the company can say, well, we don't want to sell it for that. We just want to ignore that. So there is this thing about vaccines and treatments are so important for public health that we cannot accept that this is the private property of a for-profit company that we know will do anything to maximize profit and is not interested in public health. That for me is just, yeah.
Yeah, that is
Unacceptable.
crazy. And especially also, we talked about developing countries and talking about the vaccines. The developing world saw this pandemic as a very critical moment, and they felt really the divide between,
Betrayed.
what,
Yes,
it felt like
absolutely.
the kind of, what's the word, the
Mm,
privilege and the non-privilege.
Yeah.
mm,
And this idea of, access to essential medicines. And we talk about patents. I think you had mentioned that maybe it was a Moderna or Pfizer. They had refused that other places or other companies produce this vaccine
Mhm. Absolutely.
when they had and share the knowledge when they had the capacity to do it, and to provide these vaccines
Mhm.
for these other places. I believe, if I'm not wrong, you worked on a paper with Mariana Mazzucato
Mhm.
on this for vaccines for access to the vaccines relating to the pandemic. Is that right? Could
Mhm.
you
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
about
yeah.
that?
Well, yeah, I think you said it's exactly right. We had these new vaccines, and we knew that many people in the world needed that. So we needed to make it available everywhere, actually at the same time, and ideally in an equitable way, which means those that are the most vulnerable everywhere first. So that is healthcare personnel, elderly, people with comorbidities, or otherwise that we knew, given that it was a respiratory infection, that were extra vulnerable. And so we knew we needed to create many more vaccines rapidly. And there were a number of companies in the global south that were ready to, get the technology transferred and start producing. Some were already able to do certain things, but I mean, in any case, they needed to be transferred. By the way, Moderna, they started to do their vaccine development in the United States, and then they transferred the technology to a company here in Switzerland called Lonza that became one of their main producers. And if they could learn to produce that vaccine in a question of months, why not? That could have been done in other countries as well, but they refused, exactly because that what they wanted is to sell themselves the vaccine to the highest bidder. That was the reality, and those were, of course, the industrialized countries. And I remember, because the epidemic hasn't developed in the same way everywhere, but one country that was really badly affected with many people who died was South Africa. And they even had clinical trials ongoing with several of the vaccines, but they were unable to actually access vaccines to share to use for the population. And there was even one example that was terrible, where Johnson and Johnson was also one of the vaccine producers. It was not the best vaccine, but we didn't know that back then. They had a deal that they transferred part of the technology to a South African company that produced it in South Africa, only the last step, but okay, they produce in South Africa, only to be shipped back to Europe at the moment that South Africa had not had access to any vaccine. This was such a scandal, but this is where the power of the companies to decide where they want to sell their drug and to whom they want to share the technology. And they just didn't want to share it with the global south because they want to sell vaccines. They don't want to sell technology. They want to sell vaccines, because that comes back to the to the Goldman Sachs thing, right? It's better to be able to sell every time again than to share the technology such that they can produce themselves.
Yeah. We mentioned in the beginning of our talk briefly antibiotics, and I think we should talk about this because it's really important, even though it's not really talked about. We talked about the problem with now kind of free market. We're not innovating in the right places. And one of the big problems is the world of antibiotics.
Mhm.
And from my understanding, right, antibiotics is something we take to kill bacteria, right? And the more we've used antibiotics, the more bacteria have evolved to fight against it,
Mhm.
right? And you had this quote in your presentation about, I think, the guy who discovered penicillin.
Mm,
He said that he did not invent it, nature did that, he only discovered it.
mm,
And that he had sold, I think, the patent for like $1. You know, it's
mm,
completely unimaginable when we look at the world today with the patents. But can you touch on the problem with antibiotics and how crucial and how dangerous is it if we don't address this?
yeah, absolutely. It's a very important point. Um, Two elements to your question. If we go to the question of penicillin, and quite a number of antibiotics that indeed are drugs that kill bacteria specifically, are actually natural products originally. And this is why the inventor of penicillin said, well, actually, I didn't invent it. I discovered it because it was in nature, because it was some kind of a mold that produced it, and that for a long time, penicillin is still being produced by bioreactors because it's a very complicated molecule, and we can't really synthesize it from scratch. And so there is and quite a number of antibiotics have been found in nature. Now, today we develop antibiotics. We look at what is. We still are interested to find things in nature because there is an enormous source of creativity in nature to fight bugs. But there is also the more let's say classic drug discovery development ongoing, where it's fully chemical. So and where it could be, let's say, not discovered in nature, but really created in the lab, and then let's say worthwhile a patent in our current patent law. But the problem with antibiotics is that, again, given that it's a cure, often a short-term treatment, but moreover, the problem that we have that you well described, that bacteria after a while become resistant to existing antibiotics. We have this problem of what we call antimicrobial resistance. And so what we need is actually antibiotics that we can put, new antibiotics that we can put on a shelf to only treat those people who are sick with a bacterium that has been resistant to everything that we have. So not only are we talking about short-term cures that are not a good business model to start with, it's even worse for an antibiotic, because we don't want to create a new antibiotic that we're going to widely use. We want to keep it in reserve, because for now we can still kind of get around. Most people can still be treated with existing antibiotics, although there are sometimes cases that all antibiotics have failed, but these are still rare. And so the fact that we actually want to create multiple new antibiotics that have different mechanism of action, to put them on a shelf and only use in real cases of high need, I mean, as a business model, that is a total killer. If you think that your business model needs to be based on making money from the sales. And this is where we then should say, well, no, this cannot be the business model. We need to create a different way that that we do not need to reward those that develop a new antibiotic with high sales or with a lot of money. And there are different ways in which people have been trying to either create business conditions to still give a lot of money. That is what the preferred option is for the pharmaceutical companies, like, give us a lot of money and we will do it. But there are also not-for-profit organizations that are trying to create a slightly different model. But again, for public health, I mean, this is one of the things that I find so fascinating. Like, if we would only have all these brilliant minds and scientists that are currently working in the biomed and biotech area, just kind of put them to work on antibiotics, I'm sure that we would get antibiotics in a relatively short amount of time. But there is only very few people working on it because there is so little money available, and that's kind of crazy, right?
I was talking to a veterinarian that works on horses that told me that they had a case where no antibiotic worked and they had to euthanize the horse. And they were telling me that so there are, for example, antibiotics that have, been around for a long time and that there's different generations. So the first generations have been around and so they're not very effective. The bacteria is very resistant against it. And so the new generations, fourth generations, you can only use it if necessary.
Mm.
And they told me also that there's certain regulations for this other antibiotic, Baytril, where they are only allowed to use it after doing a certain like test or to say that nothing else works, we have to use this. And I wonder, is there the same regulations in humans?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are clear guidelines, and I mean, ideally, if you go to a hospital and you have an infection, they will do some testing to try to see to which antibiotic you will still respond, etc. But that is not always available or possible, and then we go back to in low-income countries. Sometimes, if you don't have the option, then if you have a kid that comes in with a fever, and even if you don't have even the ability to check whether it's malaria or a bacterial infection, like if you don't have anything, what do? You give them everything you have, hoping that something will. It's not the best medicine, but you have a kid in your arms that is going to die otherwise, and so. The idea of rational use of medicine, because that's exactly what you describe, to kind of knowing, first of all, is it a viral infection or a bacterial? Because a viral infection, you don't need to use antibiotics. It's not going to work, so don't waste any antibiotics on that. But you need to have the diagnostics available as well. And so this is like a whole treatment or strategy to have the diagnostics to be able to test for resistance and then have different options available so that you can give the right one. But in many places, that is not the case. Now, the other thing that I think for antibiotics that is also really, really important is that a lot of the resistance is also driven by use in agriculture. And that, but because you say about veterinary use, but it is used widely in chicken feed because it gives higher, how do you say that? The chicken gets fat quicker if you also have certain antibiotics in their feed. That is not against the disease. That is just kind of as a stimulator of the growth of the chickens. In plant agriculture, they sometimes spray antibiotics on fields. And so there is so much overuse of antibiotics in agriculture, some of them that are overlapping with what we need for medicine. And that, of course, is another driver of resistance. And this is why there is this, what we call One Health approach in terms of antibiotics. We need new antibiotics in the clinic for sure, but we can only win that overall fight if we have new antibiotics. We use them rationally, but also in a way that if you need an antibiotic, you get access, because sometimes rational use is meant as rationing such that people that actually need an antibiotic to survive don't have access. That's not what we mean. It's really kind of, but we also need to do something about the total overuse for economic reasons, again, because we always circle back to the same thing, like the way our economy functions prioritizes other things than public health. And in antibiotics, this is also the problem of agriculture that gets into the mix.
Maybe we can end on this. How do you see it evolving in the future? Is this all these problems with pharmaceutical companies getting better?
And
But
on,
that has to be, sorry, go ahead.
oh, Alex, do you want to repeat your?
No.
Oh, is it me? Oh, so I wanted to ask. You mentioned about the food industry and how they pump the chickens with antibiotics, and I know there's some grave consequences from the food industry and just their practices and again, they're focused on profit over social benefits. So in the future, do you think we could have this lifestyle industry to combat big pharma and promote a more holistic approach to health?
Well, I have to believe that, otherwise, I mean, what am I doing with my life, right? So I want to be optimistic, but it's not going to be easy, because we really are fighting big powers, big financial powers, and what I have seen over my 25 years that I'm working on these issues is that these powers have become bigger and bigger. Now, where I have my optimism is that what we see in the different problems that the world is facing, from climate change to antibiotic resistance to many other things, we're struggling around the same issues. It is the way we have organized our economy, where it all is about money, making more money, and that the social purpose of businesses is no longer prioritized. This is what gets us into trouble. That is the same for climate change. And so I'm optimistic if I see younger generation coming on the street to kind of stop fossil fuel, to actually say what we need to change the way we drive our economy for our climate to be livable, because I don't know what will be first. Antibiotic resistance, such that we can't treat ourselves anymore, or a total climate breakdown. But the solutions are in the same realm, and I think we need to rethink the way we drive our economy. We need to stop with the financialization. We need to bring back actual health purpose, social purpose, well-being at the core of our economic drivers. And I think many more people will be needed to vote also for political leaders that actually promote something else than more of the same, because we're not going to get there. But I put my hope in the younger generation, such as yourselves, and in development economists that actually also break down some of the myths that currently drive the way we think in the West, certainly, about economy, and that do not see how imperialistic it is, how much we're actually ruining the rest of the world, and ourselves included in Western countries, because it's kind of there we are one global world, right? So I force myself to be optimistic, and I count on people like yourself to drive that fight. And we will be there, our generation, to support you, but we need, the new leaders to step up and drive that.
Well, Artie, I think this conversation helped us know a lot more, and maybe hopefully we'll carry on the torch to talk more about this subject and see how we can change things later on, So,
And I think we're a lot more equipped to deal with this after your talk. So a big thank you to you, Els, and
thank you for doing this.
Well, and thank you for your interest, and please keep on carrying that torch, and any further background knowledge that we can share, me and others, because we're many in this fight. And so, and we know a lot already of what, in terms of how the system doesn't work, but we need to think together about how to change it for the better.
Yeah, I completely agree.
All right.
Thank you so much.
We're good.
It's a pleasure.